All right, good morning. And we were last week ending one study and trying to get back to a study that we had interrupted back in October, which was anti-Semitism and Christianity. And I want to emphasize the "and Christianity" part. If we were just studying anti-Semitism, it'd be one thing, but how Christianity figures into the discussion is extremely important. So I was trying to bring to all our attention, if we weren't already aware of it, a news item. It came out maybe 2 weeks ago. What's the date on this here? It says 14th of January. And there was a survey done globally of 58,000 respondents in 103 countries and territories, done by the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. And what they found, at least I thought, was pretty alarming. It says nearly half of all adults worldwide hold significant anti-Semitic views, and younger people are more likely to discriminate against Jews, according to the ADL survey released on Tuesday. Why do attitudes matter so much? Because attitudes matter, which is what I would want to stress in the study of anti-Semitism, is our theology, you might call it here in this, they call it attitudes, our theology affect and lead to action, how we treat other people, in this case, the Jewish people. That's why this topic is so important, and we should also be aware of how we got to where we are, at least within the Christian European discussion, and we'll get there with time. So, there was this map that accompanied the study, and what was interesting, if you dismiss the Middle Eastern area, which we would assume there'd be high percentage of anti-Semitism, in this case 76%, if we were to dismiss that, and this is where we left off last week, what you'll find is, it's not showing it here because it's lumping it under Eastern European, but Russia is then the highest percentage of individuals that would express anti-Semitic views. This map doesn't really break it down by country, it breaks it down by region. You can definitely see, of course, the Middle East, but up here, this number is actually greater if we're just looking at Russia herself, which I find is fascinating in light of Bible prophecy, that not only the nations around Israel vehemently against Israel and the Jewish people, but so is the largest country on the planet, which is Russia. The least anti-Semitic countries were Sweden, Norway, Canada, and the Netherlands. Of course, Israel was not surveyed. In the US, 9% of respondents held significant anti-Semitic views. Russia was the most, and this is what I was saying before, so that 49% you saw earlier really is probably being countered by those, get back there, perhaps those in the Slavic areas. But if you were just to look at Russia herself, she comes in at 62%. The most anti-Semitic country in Europe, although I've never really thought of Russia as Europe. The global figure represents 108, and this is one of the most staggering things. In 10 years, the anti-Semitic views that exist or have been monitored has doubled, 108% increase in 10 years. And I don't have the words to adequately describe how dangerous this spike is, said this particular individual. So I wanted to just use that as a segue back to our discussion on anti-Semitism. And you'll have to give me a second here because that is actually at the end of my voting PowerPoint presentation. All right, so this is my anti-Semitism presentation. All right, and hopefully you'll remember, those who've been following the class, you'll remember these characters. And I got into showing these symbolic characters, we call them. They're called ecclesia and synagoga. And you would find them in the architecture and also the art of the Middle Ages. And even as far as the 19th century, I remember one structure. An ecclesia is supposed to represent the church. Synagogue is supposed to represent the Jewish people. And here, if you recall, if we look closely at how these individuals or characters are portrayed, you'll see a vast difference. Here, Ecclesia has a crown on her head. She's holding this cup, and she's got kind of a spear, but it's got a cross on the top. She looks confident. And over, trying to remember if there's anything else. Over on the right side, we have Synagoga, who, in this one over here, she's blindfolded. She's actually looking away from Ecclesia. And actually, there's a middle character, which I don't have here, which kind of portrays either wisdom or King Solomon. She's got the tablets, which you would think of the Ten Commandments or the covenant with Israel, kind of hiding behind her skirt. And she's got this kind of a comparable rod over here, but it's broken up in pieces. 1, 2, looks like 3 pieces. So this is supposed to represent how Ecclesia has supplanted or triumphed over the Jews, let's just put it bluntly, or the faith of the Jews. This one here is a different set of characters, but the same thing, Ecclesia and Synagoga. And what's even worse is you have a serpent. Instead of a blindfold, you have a serpent wrapped around her head. So, I guess this one here looks what I had thought was a money bag, kind of indicating prosperity. And there's the serpent, kind of a closer view of that. And there's our wisdom character, or King Solomon. All right, so I was bringing into the discussion artwork, how the church has utilized, and this one here has the crown taken off of Synagoga's head. And here you can see the tablets, kind of like she's hiding it as she's ashamed. And you could read more online if you want to get a refresher. I'm not going to go into it. Here's an example of an illustration, illuminated page, where we have, Synagoga's over here. She's got her blindfold on, although it's not easy to pick that out. I can't tell if that's a crown. No, there's the crown over here, or I should say right over there, which has fallen off her head. And then she's got a head of a donkey, or I think we had this discussion, is that a donkey or is that a goat? Nonetheless, she's portrayed very differently than Ecclesia, who's holding this cup, catching the blood of Jesus, is crowned, and she looks happy and confident. So it's just not in stone or on the outside of the churches or cathedrals that you find these characters, but you can also find it on the illuminated page. I don't know, I just think it's a flourish of the illuminator.
Well, I mean, I think it's supposed to go back to the Garden of Eden with the tree of life or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think that's supposed to be like.
Okay, well, I will buy it. I have no problem with that at all.
I just was curious. No, I was just wondering what you had read about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's valid. You could make that argument that there's this decision between good and evil, and ecclesia's in the good camp, and synagogue's on the evil camp. Of course, we do have Mr. Serpent down here, so again, I guess we could describe this as a good and evil type of depiction. All right, and here's a parable of the 10 virgins in Illumination. We have, interestingly, the motifs of synagogue coming into the parable of the 10 virgins. Of course, the foolish virgins are here. These are supposed to, first, I thought these were bells, but they're actually upside down lanterns. It doesn't help that they color them differently, but anyway. When I first saw it, I thought these were bell ringers, but these are the empty containers where they would have their oil. And here you have ecclesia, even though it's supposed to be one of the 5 foolish virgins. Here you see the crown being thrown off, and look what's hiding behind her head. It looks like Mr. Goat. I guess it can't be a donkey because donkeys don't have horns. And then up here, ecclesia, well, she's got her cup and her crown, and everyone's confident, and of course everything is good. Down here everyone's ashamed and fretting. So we find that motif working itself into even the illuminated page. Here's a cathedral that was completed in the 19th century, and lo and behold, you find above the doorways Miss Ecclesia and Miss Synagogue, and there's your broken staff, the tablets that are being kind of hidden in some sense, and of course she's blindfolded. So you have the same motifs going on here. And this is the 19th century, so this, you can't just say the dark Middle Ages, that there was this blindness or who knows, prejudice. We're already into the 19th century, and we still have these motifs being portrayed. And then we covered this. You find it in stained glass art. Here you got Synagogue. Now she's riding on a donkey. There's Mr. Goat. There's the crown being cast off. There's the blindfold. And now we have another addition. We have God's wrath with this sword coming down on her head. So it seems like we keep adding and adding little parts to the art to portray God's displeasure. And then over here, we're writing on a 4-headed beast, which is supposed to represent, I believe, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You could argue it's Ezekiel's cherubim, and the same symbology. And then we now have this hand coming down out of heaven, crowning ecclesia, again, like putting God's stamp of approval on the church and God's wrath on the Jews. And there's kind of a close-up of that. And then Strasbourg Cathedral was where we had these characters. And Strasbourg Cathedral was also, I brought up the Black Plague, or the Black Death, I should say, bubonic plague. This was an example of that. But at that time, the Jews were blamed and said this little character who was responsible for the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Unfortunately, the Jews were the ones that were blamed. And here we have persecution of the Jews, a Wikipedia article, and you'll see that the Jewish communities were often blamed for the outbreaks up here of the Black Death in Europe from 1348 to 1351, which was about the time ecclesia and synagogue were being put in place. Just interesting. fact to remember the timing here. And Strasbourg, where we have ecclesia and synagogue, was a place where persecution, or actually a massacre of the Jews, took place. And here's an illuminated page showing the Jews being burned by the people of Strasbourg. And here's you got your Strasbourg city or cathedral, however you want to depict that or interpret that. This was, well, I remember, so we were talking about why did the Jews become the scapegoat? Well, it was interesting that the Jews were not dying at the same rate as non-Jews. And one of the reasons why you could perhaps explain that is, one, they were kind of quarantined to start with, and number two, their burial practices were much different than non-Jews. The Jews will try to bury their dead within 24 hours of the end of life, which definitely help if you've got fleas all over an infected individual. You get them in the grave, you cut down the risk. So, but of course no one knew that at the time, and the Jews just seemed like a handy scapegoat. So this is the passage where the Jews get their belief to bury the dead within 24 hours, even though it's talking about a hangman. You're not supposed to leave a man hanging on a tree all night. I know it sounds weird, but if you ever ask a Jewish rabbi where they get their practice of burying their dead within 24 hours, they will point to this passage. Whether it makes any sense or not, that doesn't make any difference, but that's what that was up there for. All right, so then we were moving on to a different type of art, which was the desecration of the host. And these are supposed to be Jews. Here's your rabbi. And this is a dagger. And these are the little wafers that the Catholics use to remember the Lord's sacrifice. And here's a better picture of some of these wafers. So this is called host desecration. And there's another. It's considered very, very holy within the Catholic faith. And there's an article here about host desecration. Accusations against the Jews were a common reason given for massacres and expulsions throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. And then here was a wood print, and it was interesting. You have this thief who comes in, steals the hosts, then sells them to Jews. The Jews take them to their synagogues, which you see the Ten Commandments up there, and then they have this ritual whereby they desecrate the host. There's this interesting thing here where they're like burning the host, but then you have this baby in here too, which there's also accusations of Jews killing infants. And then they're caught, the Jews are caught, and then the Jews are executed. Some of them are first, these are red hot pincers. You can see the fire down here, and then eventually you will kill them. Here, I believe they're being set on fire. This is actually the person who stole the host. He's going off to be whatever, who knows what. And then everybody lives happily ever after here, worshiping, whatever they do in Catholic churches. So that was wood print that we had. Here's another host desecration. I mean, this is public art. This is art. It's not being, except for maybe the illuminated pages, stained glass windows, art, statues outside of the cathedrals. I mean, everyone's going to see this as they're coming into the cathedral. Here we have, again, another much better, more modern looking portrayal. And here we have the hosts. And what's interesting here, we actually have them bleeding. And here we have a dagger. You can see a little bit better, the blood coming out of the hosts. And there's another one over here, the blood dripping out. All right, so the Brussels Massacre, I'm trying to remember what this was about. This is over, okay, so this is another example of the massacres that occur as a result of host desecration. There was a synagogue in Brussels where a number of Jews were accused and then executed. And then the community of Jews were banished out of Brussels. All right, so just trying to share with you some of the artwork of the time that was common, and how do you think this would affect one's attitude toward the Jewish people? I mean, clearly this is going to feed into anti-Semitism. If you memorialize these stories in print or in stone or in stained glass windows, they're going to remain in circulation for decades and centuries, most likely perpetuating distrust, if not hatred, towards a particular group, in this case, the Jewish people. Today, centuries removed from the times in which we've been looking at here through art, we can look back and we can think to ourselves that we're highly educated, we're a very well-informed society, and that never would such things occur in our day. Our modern society would surely not go around telling stories that breed hatred and suspicion and bigotry against a particular group or race that would lead to violence against them. Surely we're much better than these people in the Dark Ages or Middle Ages.
Go away.
My response would be, Joe?
There was a lot of that. There was a lot of that going on.
Oh,
I can turn it off.
It's just not doing anything. There was a lot of that going on with the Chronicles of the Elders of Zion thing during World War I and World War II, circulated in the United States and other places. So that undercurrent kept going. It was interesting because it started off so well with George Washington sending a letter to the Jews saying, yes, we would like you to come and be here, and you'll have the religious freedom. And there's even individual stories from different states that are very compelling and interesting, like Georgia and Savannah. They were going through a plague, and they had on the list of the charter, no Catholics, no Jews. And the Jews came ashore and said, we'll cure you of this illness if you let us come and help you. And they did, so they changed the charter. And it's just interesting where pockets of Jews landed in America, but these undercurrents kept coming up that were untrue from other people.
All right. Well, I was trying to say that, we think that we're better, maybe that was 200, 300 years ago, and we think we're much more enlightened, but I would kind of question whether that's true, especially, when you saw the double increase in anti-Semitic attitudes in the last 10 years. So I have this question: are we really incapable of repeating rumors and believing in crazy stories that result in singling out a particular ethnic group and portray that group as unclean, troublesome, dangerous, and a threat to our general well-being? And we must remove them from our society. Are we incapable of doing something like that, having those attitudes? Well, I would suggest to you that maybe we can look a little bit more closely at other people amongst us, not just the Jews, just to kind of give you an idea where this attitude and this tendency to want to believe incredible stories, how that is still something we have to wrestle with and deal with in our day and age. So going back a few months, anyone here watched the presidential debate, the only presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? We got a handful. Okay, we got a small percentage who did. Back in October, the only debate occurred, and the most controversial part in that debate, as far as I'm concerned, was when former President Trump repeated a rumor or story about Haitian immigrants living in Springfield, Ohio. Anyone remember that? Yeah. the former president shared a fourth-hand rumor about Haitian immigrants eating people's pets, eating their dogs, eating their cats, eating their ducks. And when various news groups looked into the story, they discovered no credible cases of such things. And what was interesting, the only verifiable account of someone eating or shooting a goose, in this case, it took place on a golf course, and it turned out to be a Caucasian white individual. Here's our Springfield. I also caught on the news shortly after, there was an account of an African-American woman killing a cat who then began biting into it before the police were called. But what was interesting about this, it was 170 miles away in Canton, not in Springfield. And what was even more interesting, this woman was an American citizen. And I bring up these facts because I want to remind us that these are the types of stories that I'm referring to when, bigotry always has a storyline. There's some story always being told that causes an individual to become bigoted and prejudiced against another person. You just don't meet somebody out of the blue, and maybe you're blindfolded, and you hate them. It's because you've been told something about that individual, something bad. And usually if it's a group of people that you hate, there's a story going on that, like in the case of the Jews, they're stealing the hosts. They're desecrating the hosts. When COVID hit in the Middle East, the Jews were being blamed for COVID. These are the types of stories that will foster bigotry, and in this case, anti-Semitism. Imagine, I had this crazy idea. I said, with regards to Springfield, Ohio, imagine if the Board of Commissioners in Springfield decided to modify, keeping with this idea of how art can breed and foster hatred toward another group. Imagine if this mural here was changed, if the city commissioners of Springfield decided they're going to come up and replace this mural with a new one. And what are they going to put up there? Well, they're going to put up a mural of black-skinned individuals with knives and forks in their hands, sitting behind a kitchen table, and on their dinner plates were dogs and cats. Something like that. And imagine that being up there for 10 years, 100 years, 200 years. Imagine people driving by in their cars, walking through downtown and seeing that. What do you think it's going to do to people's attitudes toward African Americans, or in this case, those supposed to be Haitians? Nothing good's going to come from something like that. And what's even worse in the case of the artwork with the Christians, those are on their buildings of worship. This is just in downtown
There's people against
Springfield.
blacks because they ate
It's
cats.
even worse when you have Christians depicting scenes that instill hatred toward other people and putting it into their places of worship. And yet, that's what Christians did for hundreds of years. So, are we incapable of repeating what those in the Middle Ages did in castigating and depicting a group of people in a very evil light? Fortunately, the accusations against the Haitians turned out to be false. And the fallout hasn't been anything close to what historically the Jews experienced after being repeatedly and falsely accused of crazy things like stabbing little discs of flour, post-desecration. There were some bomb threats made in Springfield, and schools and public buildings had to be closed, but they all turned out to be pranks, and thankfully no one has been physically hurt. But back in the Middle Ages, that wasn't the case with the Jews. And violence against the Jews on account of libelous stories was a very frequent occurrence. Here we have an illustration of an event or incident against the Jews that took place in 1338. There was this city named Deggendorf in Bavaria, which is today part of Germany. In 1338, the local town administrators and certain members of the upper class gentry, these people set fire to the houses of the Jews in the city and slaughtered all the Jewish inhabitants of the city. And then that killing spree spread to 21 other places in Bavaria. What was interesting is that all this destruction benefited the impoverished townspeople, and they were more than happy to come in, swoop up the loot left behind by the Jews. And the murderers and instigators were not only pardoned by the Duke at that time, but the murderers were honored with an edict of commendation, and a memorial church was erected on the spot where the Jewish synagogue, which they had burned down, was located. It was after the fact that they made up the story that the Jews were punished because they desecrated the host. And this is a memorial of that host desecration massacre. So, let's ask a question, a hard question. Who are the ones who are telling these stories? What group of people are telling these stories? It's not atheists. It's not Jews. It's not Muslims. We're kind of like running out of people. It's the Christians. It's the Christians are the ones who are telling these stories. And in the 14th and 15th centuries, which is pretty much the time period we've been looking at, specifically what group of Christians would we be talking about? Be the Roman Catholic Church. That's about all there was in Europe in the 15th century. The Protestant Reformation wouldn't arrive for another 100 years. And you might start thinking, well, this is something the Roman Catholic Church is notorious for. It's the evil old Roman Catholic Church. They're the ones. They're the only ones who's responsible for all this. Well, I'd have to shock you and say no. Just give us a little bit more time here, and you'll see that the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants weren't a whole lot better. Now, if you know anything about the Protestant Reformation, you'll know that Martin Luther was right there in the midst of it. He was a Catholic monk, and it wasn't his intention to create a split, but after seeing the response by the Catholic Church to his suggestions for reform, Luther pretty much ended up with this Protestant church in Germany, and then it was followed, for example, in John Calvin in France as we get into the 16th century. So I want to spend a little bit of time on Martin Luther, because if you don't know who Martin Luther is and how he plays into the role of anti-Semitism, you really need to be educated. So let's start. Who was Martin Luther? Well, he was born in 1483. He died in 1546. He was a professor of theology. He actually composed music, which is probably a little known fact. He was a priest, he was a monk, and as I said earlier, he's a key figure in the Protestant Reformation. And he came to reject several teachings and practices of the Catholic Church, and his refusal to renounce his writings, his criticisms, led to Pope Leo X excommunicating Martin Luther from the Catholic Church. And the emperor at that time declared Martin Luther an outlaw. So he had what do you call, like a wanted poster. He was a wanted man, let me put it that way. And what's interesting about Martin Luther, very early in his life, he spoke very, very kindly of the Jewish people. Starting in 1519, Martin Luther wrote the following: "Absurd theologians defend hatred for the Jews. What Jew would consent to enter our ranks," referring to the ranks of Christianity, "what Jew would consent to enter our ranks when he sees the cruelty and enmity we wreak on them, that in our behavior towards them we less resemble Christians than beasts?" All right, I'm not a fan of Martin Luther, but I'm totally in agreement with what Martin Luther just wrote in 1519.
He changed.
Now, Martin Luther, when he wrote this, was 36 years old, but something happened within a span of 4 years. Martin Luther was writing this. And you'd think this must be a different Martin Luther. "If I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian." Actually, I may be getting ahead of myself. Let me keep on reading this. It will be a little bit later. You'll see what I'm alarmed about. "I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. The Christians, have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, they show them nothing of Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to popishness and mockery. If the apostles, who also were Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. When we are inclined to boast of our position as Christians, we should remember that we are but Gentiles, while the Jews are of the lineage of Christ. We are aliens and in-laws. They are blood relatives, cousins, and brothers of our Lord. Therefore, if one is to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews are actually nearer to Christ than we are. If we really want to help them, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. If some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? After all, we ourselves are not good Christians either." Okay, so this is not the one that I was going to castigate as far as, this is actually still in his favorable toward the Jews time period. What Martin Luther was thinking was actually that the Jews were opposed to Catholicism, and all they needed was Reformation to open their eyes and cast off all the extra stuff that the Catholic Church has added to the Christian faith. And Martin Luther, with his message, he's going to open the eyes of the Jews. That's what he thought, and this is what he was thinking when he wrote this, that the whole problem why the Jews reject Jesus is because of Catholicism. And Martin Luther is here to save the day, and he's also going to save the Jews. This is Martin Luther's mind early on, and this is part of that time period. What you're going to find, and we're running out of time, there's going to be a different Martin Luther that will show up on the scene not long after this. And that Martin Luther is going to shock you. You're going to wonder if maybe Adolf Hitler was actually a Protestant reformer, because you're not going to see much difference between what Martin Luther wrote and what Adolf Hitler and the Nazis did. And that sounds shocking, but just stay tuned. Tune in next week, same time, same channel. Anyone have any questions? Okay, well, thank you.